The year was 1886, and the land had forgotten the color green. Under a sky the shade of bleached bone, Ezra Donovan crawled. The heat was a physical weight, a malevolent presence that pressed down on his shoulders and baked the breath in his lungs. His world had shrunk to the cracked, sun-scorched earth beneath his hands and the shimmering horizon that promised nothing but more of the same. He was a man whittled down to his most essential parts: thirst, hunger, and a stubborn, fading pulse. Days ago, was it weeks, he had been a man with a name and a purpose. He'd had a horse, a rifle, and a worn saddle that knew the shape of him better than any person ever had. Now the horse was gone, a casualty of a dried-up riverbed and its own exhaustion. The rifle lay abandoned somewhere back in the dust, too heavy to carry, its metal a brand against his skin. All that remained of his former life was a single, rock-hard biscuit in the bottom of his canvas satchel. It was more a relic than a meal, a monument to a time when food was something to be expected rather than dreamed of. His mind, brittle from dehydration, drifted back to the cascade of failures that had led him here. The ranch in Montana, lost to a blizzard that had buried his small herd and his even smaller hopes. The subsequent drift south, chasing rumors of work that evaporated like morning mist. He had been running from the ghost of his wife, Clara, whose face he could barely summon anymore, lost in a fog of grief and hardship. He remembered the quiet disappointment in her eyes the last time he'd left, promising a better life he had never managed to deliver. Now, he was failing even at the simple act of staying alive. The land itself seemed to be rejecting him, its vast, silent indifference, a judgment on his life's ledger. Loneliness was a familiar coat he had worn for years, but out here it became something else entirely. It was an active, corrosive thing, eating away at the edges of his sanity. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rasp of his own breathing and the whisper of hot wind across the plains. It was a silence that made a man feel like the last soul on earth, a forgotten footnote in a story no one was reading. He had spoken to no one for so long that the sound of his own voice, when he tried to croak out a prayer for water, felt alien and shocking. His routine had become a grim parody of life. At dawn, he would rise from a shallow scrape in the dirt and begin to walk, his eyes scanning the featureless landscape for any sign of life, any dip in the terrain that might harbor moisture. The sun would climb, becoming his tormentor, and he would trudge on, his thoughts a slow, circling eddy of regret. By midday, he would find what little shade he could, the meager shadow of a yucca or a sun-bleached boulder, and wait out the worst of the heat. Then he would walk again, until the sky bruised into nightfall and the cold of the desert descended, a sharp and sudden contrast to the day's fire. He would huddle for warmth, the biscuit in his bag, a small, hard comfort against his ribs, and wait to do it all again. It was a life of pure resignation, a slow march toward an inevitable end. This day felt different. The fire in his belly had gone cold, replaced by a hollow emptiness that seemed to be sucking him inward. His legs would no longer obey. He stumbled, caught himself, and then fell, his face hitting the hard pan with a dull thud. He lay there, the dust tasting of grit and finality. He had nothing left to fight with. The will that had driven him across hundreds of miles of unforgiving territory had finally frayed and snapped. He closed his eyes, thinking not of Clara or the ranch, but only of the profound, simple relief of letting go. The world began to fade into a dark, humming quiet. When awareness returned, it was not with a jolt, but as a slow, creeping tide. The first thing he registered was a shadow falling over him, offering a sliver of respite from the relentless sun. He blinked, his eyelids feeling as heavy as stones. A figure sat on the ground a few feet away, as still as the rocks scattered around them. It was an old man, his skin the color of tanned leather, creased and folded into a map of a long and arduous life. He was gaunt, his cheekbones sharp beneath his skin, his hair long and silver white. He wore simple buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his chest bare and thin. He was native, Apache by the look of him, though Ezra was no expert. He was just another creature of this desert, worn down by its harshness. Ezra's first instinct was a flicker of fear, a deeply ingrained prejudice that was part of the very air men like him breathed. But the fear died as quickly as it came. The old man was no threat. He looked as close to death as Ezra felt, his dark eyes holding a deep, weary calm. He wasn't looking at Ezra with malice or pity, but with a kind of distant, shared understanding. He simply sat, his hands resting on his knees, breathing the same scorching air. The old man's gaze was steady, unwavering. He made no move, spoke no word. He was just there, a sudden, unexpected witness to Ezra's lonely demise. For a long moment, they existed in a tableau of shared suffering, two men from different worlds brought to the same desperate end by the same indifferent land. The silence between them was different from the crushing emptiness Ezra had endured before. It was a weighted silence, an acknowledgement of their mutual plight. Ezra pushed himself up on one elbow, the effort sending a wave of dizziness through him. His hand went instinctively to his satchel. He could feel the hard, round shape of the biscuit through the canvas. His last meal, his last connection to life, his stomach clenched with a phantom pang of hunger, so sharp it was like a knife wound. It was his. He had guarded it, rationed his thoughts about it, saved it for a moment, just like this, a final burst of energy to push him one more mile. He looked from his bag to the old man. The elder's eyes were closed now, his head bowed slightly, as if in prayer or exhaustion. A dry, rasping sound came from his throat, a cough that shook his frail frame. In that moment, Ezra saw not an Indian, not a stranger, not a potential threat, but a reflection of himself. He saw a human being at the very edge of existence. A strange battle waged within him. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at him to hoard his last resource, to turn away and pretend the old man wasn't there. It was the law of this land. The strong, or at least the fortunate, survived. The weak perished. To give away his food was to give away his life. It was madness, it was suicide. But another voice, one he hadn't heard in years, whispered from a deeper place. It was the voice of the man he used to be, the man who believed in decency, the man Clara had married. What was one more day of life worth, if it was purchased by ignoring the suffering of another man right in front of him? What was the point of surviving until sundown, only to die tomorrow with the memory of this man's face haunting his final moments? To die alone was one thing, to die with a shriveled soul was another. He fumbled with the clasp of his satchel, his fingers clumsy and weak. He pulled out the biscuit. It was pale and dense, more like a stone than food. It felt impossibly heavy in his palm. With his thumb, he found the seam that ran down its middle from the baking process. He pressed, putting the last of his strength into the effort. The biscuit resisted, then cracked with a sharp snap, breaking cleanly in two. He held one half out to the old man. The elder's eyes opened. They fixed on the offered food, then rose to meet Ezra's. There was no surprise in his expression, only that same deep, quiet assessment. He did not move for a long moment, and Ezra's arm began to tremble with the strain. He thought the old man might refuse, that his gesture would be rejected. Then, slowly, the elder reached out a trembling hand and took the piece of biscuit. His fingers were cool and dry against Ezra's. He brought the food to his mouth and took a small, deliberate bite, chewing with a patience that seemed almost holy. He did not devour it like a starving man, but consumed it with a kind of reverence, as if it were more than just sustenance. Ezra watched him, his own hunger, a roaring void inside him. He put his half of the biscuit to his own lips and bit into it. The dry, dusty taste filled his mouth. It was tasteless, hard, but it was something. It was life. They ate in silence, the only sound the faint crunching of the hardtack. When the elder had finished his last crumb, he licked his lips, and his gaze met Ezra's one last time. It was a long, searching look that seemed to see past the grime and despair into the very core of him. There was no thanks, no spoken word. There was only that look. Then, with a grace that belied his age and frailty, the old man rose to his feet. He stood for a moment, a thin, stark silhouette against the blinding sky, and then he turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the shimmering heat haze from which he had emerged. Ezra watched him go until he was just a wavering speck, and then nothing. He was alone again. He had shared his last hope. A profound and desolate emptiness washed over him, far worse than the hunger. He had performed a final, futile act of charity, and for what? To die with a clean conscience. The desert didn't care about conscience. He was a fool, a damned fool. He fell back against the hot earth, the last of his energy gone, and let the darkness take him completely. His descent was not into sleep, but into a deeper, more final place. He was adrift in a sea of fevered images and fragmented memories. He saw Clara's hand waving goodbye, the snow falling over the carcasses of his cattle, the mocking shimmer of a mirage on the horizon. Time ceased to have meaning. He was dimly aware of the sun setting, the world turning from orange to purple to black. The cold seeped into his bones, and he lacked the strength to even shiver. This, he thought with a strange sense of detachment, was it. This was the end of Ezra Donovan, a man who had lost everything, and then gave away the last thing he had. The cold was the worst part. It was a deep, invasive chill that felt like death itself. He imagined his blood turning to sludge, his heart slowing its beat. He was no longer fighting. He was simply waiting. He floated in the blackness, a tiny, insignificant spark about to be extinguished. He wondered if anyone would ever find his bones, or if they would just be scoured away by the wind and sand, leaving no trace he had ever existed. Then came the sound. At first, he thought it was the pounding of his own heart, a final, frantic rebellion against the inevitable, but it was too rhythmic, too powerful. It was a deep, resonant drumming that seemed to come from the earth itself. It grew louder, closer, a thunder that had no storm. He forced his eyes open, a sliver of vision in the pre-dawn gloom. The sky was a charcoal grey, smeared with the first hint of light. And the horizon was moving. It wasn't a hallucination. A dark, flowing line was approaching, resolving itself into individual shapes. Horses, dozens of them, hundreds. They moved with a disciplined speed, their hooves creating the thunder that had woken him. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Ezra's dying consciousness. A war party. He had stumbled into a war party. His single act of kindness had been a beacon, leading them right to him. They had come to finish the job. He tried to move, to crawl, to hide behind the rock he had collapsed near, but his limbs were useless. He could only lie there, a helpless witness to his own destruction. The riders swept closer, their forms becoming clear in the growing light. They were Apache warriors, their faces grim and purposeful, their long hair streaming behind them. They carried rifles and lances, and the sight of them was the most terrifying thing Ezra had ever seen. They flowed around him like a river parting around a stone, forming a wide, silent circle. The air was thick with the scent of horse and leather and dust. 300 men, Ezra guessed, maybe more. 300 silent, imposing figures, all looking down at him. The thunder of their arrival subsided into an unnerving quiet, the only sounds the snorting of their ponies and the creak of leather. Then, from the center of the line, 2 riders emerged. One was the old man, Kuruk. He sat atop a fine-looking pinto, his posture now straight and dignified. The weariness was gone from his face, replaced by an aura of quiet authority. He looked not like a dying wanderer, but a king. Beside him was a younger, powerfully built warrior, whose face was marked with the calm confidence of a leader. They dismounted and walked toward Ezra. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the blow. He had been a fool twice over, once for giving his food, and again for thinking it mattered. "He is the one?" The younger man's voice was deep and resonant. He spoke English, his words careful and measured. Kuruk did not speak, but he nodded, his eyes fixed on Ezra. The younger man knelt beside Ezra, his presence blocking out the grey sky. Ezra flinched, but the man's movements were gentle. He looked Ezra over, his gaze clinical but not unkind. "You are close to the spirit world," the man said. It wasn't a question. Ezra could only manage a dry, rasping noise. "Kuruk, our elder, told us what you did," the warrior continued. "He was on his vision quest. He had gone into the desert with no food and no water to seek guidance for our people. He was at his weakest. You found him. You had one piece of bread left for your entire life." He paused, his eyes searching Ezra's. "And you broke it in two." Ezra's mind struggled to process the words. Vision, quest, elder. He had not stumbled upon a fellow beggar, but a holy man in the midst of a sacred ritual. The warrior went on, his voice a low rumble. "Our people are pressed. The blue coats push us from the east, the settlers from the west. Our lands shrink, our ways are threatened." Kuruk went to the spirits to ask how we might endure. He believed his prayer was unanswered. He was ready to die. And then you came. He gestured to the silent ranks of warriors surrounding them. "To us, this is a powerful sign. A white man, our enemy, starving and with nothing, shared his last breath of life with an Apache. Not for gain, not for show, but because his heart told him to. In our world, such an act has meaning. It is a message from the Creator. It says that not all men are our enemies. It says that honor can be found in the most unexpected places." A warrior came forward with a water skin. The younger man took it, lifted Ezra's head gently, and trickled cool, clean water onto his cracked lips. It was the sweetest thing Ezra had ever tasted. It was the taste of mercy. He drank, coughed, and drank again. Another man brought jerky, and they gave him a small piece to chew, bringing him back from the brink slowly, carefully. As strength, or at least the promise of it, began to seep back into him, Ezra looked at Kuruk. The old man's face was unreadable, but his eyes held a glimmer of something profound. He had not just been a recipient of charity, he had been a test Ezra had passed without even knowing he was being graded. "We cannot give you back what you have lost," the warrior said, seeming to read Ezra's life of failures in his face. "We cannot give you a home among our people. Our paths are different, but your act must be honored. A gift must be answered with a gift." Kuruk spoke for the first time, his voice soft but carrying in the stillness. He spoke in his own tongue, a series of short musical phrases. The younger warrior listened intently, then looked back at Ezra. "The elder says that his vision came after he ate your bread. He saw that the path for his people is not one of wealth, but of spirit, of holding to our ways. There is a place our grandfathers knew, a canyon where the rock weeps yellow tears, gold. It was a sacred place, but its power is a poison for our people now. It draws the white man's greed and brings only violence and sorrow. It has no more use for us." Kuruk reached into a pouch at his side and drew out a small, rolled-up piece of deer hide, tied with a leather thong. He held it out to Ezra. Ezra, his hand trembling, reached out and took it. It was soft and supple in his grasp. "It is a map," the warrior explained. "It leads to the canyon of sunken gold. For us, it is a memory. For you, it can be a new beginning, a life for a life. This is the balance." Ezra looked from the scroll in his hand to the faces of the 300 warriors watching him. He saw no hostility, no threat. He saw respect. He, Ezra Donovan, a failure and a drifter, was being looked upon with respect by men who had every reason to hate him. It was a feeling so foreign and so powerful, it threatened to break him. Tears welled in his eyes, not of sorrow or self-pity, but of overwhelming, humbling gratitude. They did not leave him there. They lifted him onto a spare horse, strapping him gently to the saddle. They rode for the rest of the day, moving out of the barren flatlands and into the foothills, where scrub oak and juniper began to dot the landscape. They made camp by a small, clear stream and shared their food with him. No one spoke to him directly, but he no longer felt the oppressive weight of loneliness. He was surrounded by a silent, powerful fellowship. He was safe. The next morning they brought him to the crest of a ridge that overlooked a long valley. In the distance he could see the faint, smudged line of a wagon road. He was back in the world of men. The warrior who spoke English gave him a full water skin, a bag of dried meat, and the reins to the horse he was on. "From here you go alone," he said. "May you find what you seek." Ezra turned to Kuruk, who had watched the entire exchange from his own horse. He wanted to say something, to express the magnitude of what they had done for him, but words felt cheap and inadequate. He looked at the old man, and in his own eyes tried to convey the thanks that was bursting in his chest. He nodded his head, a gesture of deep and profound respect. Kuruk held his gaze for a long moment, and then, for the first time, the barest hint of a smile touched the corners of his ancient lips. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in return. Then he turned his pinto, and without a backward glance, led his 300 men back into the wilderness, melting into the landscape as if they were a part of it. Ezra sat on the horse, watching them go until they were gone. He was alone once more, but everything had changed. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the memory of thunderous hoofbeats and an act of impossible grace. The landscape was no longer his enemy. It was a place of miracles. He looked down at the deerskin roll still clutched in his hand. He untied the thong and carefully unrolled it. On the soft hide, drawn in charcoal and berry juice, was a crude but clear map of canyons and mesas, with a single deliberate mark deep within the maze of lines. The canyon of sunken gold. It was real. It was his. But as he stared at the map, he knew the gold was not the true treasure he had been given. The real treasure was the memory of breaking a biscuit in half. It was the lesson that even in the deepest pit of despair, when all seems lost, a single act of humanity can change the world. It had saved his life, but more than that, it had saved his soul. He was no longer Ezra Donovan, the failure. He was the man who had shared his last meal. He rolled the map carefully and tucked it securely inside his shirt. He turned his horse not towards the nearest town to buy a mining pan and a pickaxe, but simply toward the future. The gold could wait. First, he had to learn how to live again, guided not by what he could take from the world, but by what he could give. He urged the horse forward, his back straight, his eyes clear, a man reborn in the heart of the desert. The journey to the canyon would be long, but for the first time in years, Ezra Donovan knew exactly where he was going.
Her age was a brand seared onto her by every scornful glance in Redemption Gulch. Abigail Sawyer was a woman deemed finished, invisible before her time. But the West held secrets deeper than any canyon, and a love more defiant than any outlaw. For beyond the town's cruel whispers, the Cheyenne elder, his own heart burdened by profound loss, would see the fire in her that everyone else had dismissed. Together, they would forge a bond that would not only challenge the harsh judgments of their world, but also unveil a truth that would shake Redemption Gulch to its very foundations. This is their story. Abigail Sawyer knew the language of solitude well. Her hands, though weathered, moved with a practiced grace, whether coaxing stubborn vegetables from her small, arid garden patch, all that remained of her father's legacy, or mending the torn fabrics of townsfolk who offered meager payment and an abundance of pitying looks. 40 years had etched themselves onto her face, a number that, in the unforgiving arithmetic of the frontier, often meant a life concluded rather than one still unfolding. Her small cabin, standing apart at the edge of Redemption Gulch, was a fortress of quiet dignity against the subtle, persistent siege of societal expectation. The town's matriarchs, like Mrs. Pendleton, whose pronouncements carried the weight of scripture, would sigh and remark on what a capable woman Abigail was, always followed by the unspoken lament of her solitary state. The few bachelors or widowers who passed through Redemption Gulch scanned the younger, brighter blooms, their eyes sliding past Abigail as if she were part of the landscape. The bitterest pill had been the loss of her main farmland. Bartholomew Higgins, a man whose smile never quite reached his avaricious eyes, had arrived with a smooth tongue and a cleverly disputed deed. He had taken the best of her land, leaving her with just enough to scrape by, his victory a smug pronouncement of her decline. Abigail endured these slights with a composure that many misinterpreted as passivity. But beneath the surface, a keen mind observed, noted, and filed away the hypocrisies of Redemption Gulch. Her gaze would often stray to the distant, hazy peaks of the Medicine Bow Mountains, where the Cheyenne were said to roam. The townsfolk spoke of them in hushed, fearful tones, but Abigail felt a strange resonance with those untamed lands, a sense that life there, however harsh, might be more honest. She possessed a strength honed not in conflict, but in quiet endurance, her observations sharp, her thoughts her own closely guarded counsel. The raw wound of Higgins' land acquisition was painfully fresh when he chose the town's mercantile as the stage for his next casual cruelty. Abigail was present, hoping to trade a meticulously crafted quilt, weeks of finger-pricking labor for essential supplies. Martha, a young woman whose prettiness was only surpassed by her eagerness for male approval, was also there, captivated by Higgins' booming voice. His eyes, landing on Abigail, narrowed with a dismissive smirk. He addressed Martha loudly, ensuring all could hear that a flower as fair as her shouldn't be found in such wilted company. He gestured towards Abigail, suggesting Martha align herself with those who represented a future, not with someone whose prime was a fading memory. A wave of heat washed over Abigail's face. Her fingers tightened on the quilt. The storekeeper suddenly found the arrangement of his shelves fascinating. Other customers developed an urgent need to examine distant goods. Higgins, basking in the attention, continued his flirtatious banter with Martha, each word a tiny, poisoned dart aimed at Abigail. She completed her meager transaction in silence, her chin held high, and walked out, the echo of constrained giggles following her into the dusty street. The weight of their collective disdain felt almost physical. Later that day, dust plumed on the horizon as a rider brought news. A Cheyenne band, led by an elder, had established a temporary camp near Willow Creek, several miles east, for trading. A nervous tremor went through Redemption Gulch. Old fears, some real, many imagined, resurfaced. Higgins immediately seized upon it, his voice loudest in proclaiming the potential danger. Abigail found herself needing supplies beyond the mercantile's limited stock, and the thought of enduring more pitying stares was unbearable. Willow Creek had a small, remote trading post. An impulse, sharp and clear, urged her to go. It was a chance to breathe air untainted by the town's judgment, even if it meant venturing closer to what others deemed perilous. She packed a few items, a resolute set to her jaw. The confines of Redemption Gulch were suffocating. She sought the open, honest breath of the prairie. The path to Willow Creek was a solitary trek, winding through sun-baked earth and whispering grasses. With each step away from Redemption Gulch, Abigail felt a measure of peace return. The trading post itself was a humble, weathered structure, managed by Silas, an aging, laconic trapper. As she approached, she saw them, two Cheyenne warriors, their presence striking against the muted landscape. And then, another figure older, his bearing imbued with an innate dignity that transcended his simple attire. His face, a chronicle of seasons lived beneath an open sky, was etched with sorrow, yet his eyes held a profound, steady wisdom. This, she sensed, was Black Kettle, their elder. He turned as she drew near, his gaze meeting hers, direct, appraising, but devoid of malice. Abigail, usually so reserved, felt an unexpected easing of her internal defenses. She offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He returned it with equal subtlety. Silas shuffled out, grumbling a hello. Abigail began her trade, bartering precious dried herbs for flour and salt. One sack of grain proved unexpectedly cumbersome. As she prepared to struggle with it, a shadow fell beside her. Black Kettle stepped forward. Without a word, He gestured towards the sack, then effortlessly lifted it, placing it gently where she could manage. "Pahe," he said, his voice a low rumble. Silas, ever observant despite his gruff exterior, supplied the translation. "That's a thank you, or close to it. Name's Black Kettle." Abigail looked into the elder's eyes, truly seeing him. She offered her own thank you, her voice quiet but clear, adding that he was kind. A brief, almost startled expression flickered across his stoic face before he simply nodded and rejoined his companions. The exchange was fleeting, minimal in words, yet it resonated deeply within Abigail. A moment of unadorned human courtesy, a fragile bridge across a vast cultural divide. Her return journey was shadowed by an unwelcome encounter. Bart Higgins, on horseback, saw her on the trail, noting her direction of travel. By nightfall, his poisonous insinuations had taken root in the fertile ground of town gossip. He announced in the saloon, his voice thick with feigned concern, that Abigail Sawyer had been seen consorting with the hostiles, coming directly from the direction of their camp. He painted her as a woman of questionable loyalties, hinting at dark possibilities. He conveniently omitted any mention of the trading post. Higgins was already eyeing the fertile lands around Willow Creek, lands the Cheyenne often used for grazing. If he could manufacture sufficient fear, portray them as an imminent threat, he might just be able to claim those lands too. Abigail, already an outcast, was the perfect pawn in his scheme. The town's demeanor towards Abigail frosted over completely. Doors that had once creaked open a grudging inch now remained firmly bolted. Children, echoing their parents' anxieties, darted away from her path. The isolation she had always navigated now became a stark, unyielding wall. She found herself increasingly drawn to the solitude of the prairie, her walks often taking her to vantage points where she could observe the distant Cheyenne camp. She watched them from afar, hidden by rocks or tall grass, noting the rhythms of their daily life. Children playing, women tending tasks, men engaged in pursuits that spoke of a deep connection to the land. It was not spying born of malice, but of a burgeoning, inexplicable empathy. Black Kettle's simple act of kindness stood in stark contrast to the town's escalating hostility. A sense grew within her that her path was diverging, leading her away from the life Redemption Gulch had dictated. The atmosphere in Redemption Gulch curdled further. Higgins, relentless in his ambition, stoked the embers of fear into a crackling blaze. He spoke of the Cheyenne as a looming danger, a barrier to progress that needed to be decisively removed. His pronouncements were draped in civic duty, but his eyes, when he thought no one was looking, held the unmistakable glint of avarice for the lands near Willow Creek. One morning, the cry went up, cattle rustled. Jedediah Finch, a rancher known more for his nervousness than his acumen, whose land bordered the area the Cheyenne frequented, was frantic. Higgins materialized at his side almost instantly, his face a mask of theatrical outrage. It was the Cheyenne, he declared, his voice resonating with certainty. Who else, he demanded, could it be? They had been too quiet, he asserted, clearly biding their time for such treachery. A grim-faced crowd quickly assembled, fear rapidly outstripping reason. Higgins, a practiced conductor of public alarm, called for a posse to track the thieves and deliver swift justice. Men reached for their rifles, their judgment clouded. Abigail observed from the periphery, a cold dread tightening in her chest. Only the day before, while gathering herbs near the creek, she had seen two of Higgins' own men whose loyalty was notoriously for sale, discreetly herding a small group of cattle eastward. Their path led away from Finch's property, but crucially, also away from the Cheyenne encampment. Their furtive movements and constant, anxious glances had struck her as peculiar then. Now, the pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Higgins was manufacturing a crisis. He was sacrificing a few of Finch's cattle to ignite a conflict, to create a pretext to drive out the Cheyenne. Or worse, the cold calculation of it sent a shiver down Abigail's spine. These Cheyenne, Black Kettle, had offered her a moment of respect, of shared humanity. Higgins and his supporters offered only deceit and contempt. A steely resolve solidified within her. She could not, would not, remain a passive observer to this injustice. The townsfolk were ensnared in a web of fear and Higgins' manipulations. Someone had to alert Black Kettle. The thought was terrifying. To approach a Cheyenne camp alone, as a white woman, with tensions at this pitch, was to court disaster. Arrows, or far worse, could be her welcome. And if the townsfolk discovered her actions, the label of traitor would be swiftly followed by a rope. Yet, the image of Black Kettle's dignified countenance, the echo of his quiet sorrow, and the unexpected kindness he had shown her, all coalesced to override her fear. He was a man acquainted with loss, much like herself. There was a silent understanding there, a connection that transcended spoken language. She slipped away from the agitated crowd, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. She knew the hidden trails, the swiftest routes to Willow Creek. Every rustle of sagebrush, every shadow that danced at the edge of her vision, seemed an accuser. But she pressed on, propelled by a desperate yearning for truth, and an emerging, unspoken kinship with a people she barely knew, yet was beginning to understand far more profoundly than those she had lived amongst her entire life. The prairie stretched before her, vast and indifferent, yet it now felt less like a barrier and more like a precarious bridge to justice. The trek was an agony of heightened senses and raw nerves. Abigail moved with the stealth of a hunted creature through the tall grasses and shadowed ravines, imagining Higgins' posse at her heels, or unseen Cheyenne scouts marking her progress. Each snapped twig was a thunderclap in the taut silence. When the conical shapes of the teepees at Willow Creek finally emerged from the landscape, smoke spiraling gently into the late afternoon air, her breath hitched. There was no retreat now. She advanced with deliberate slowness, her hands held open, palms forward in a gesture of peace. A sharp bark, then another, announced her presence. Figures emerged from the lodges, warriors, their expressions impassive, weapons appearing with startling suddenness. A cold wave of fear washed over her, but she compelled her trembling legs forward. She had to reach Black Kettle. She called out, her voice quavering but carrying, that she came in peace, that she must speak with Black Kettle. A tall warrior, his chest adorned with painted symbols that spoke a language she did not know, stepped towards her, his gaze intense and questioning. He spoke in the Cheyenne tongue, his words sharp. Abigail shook her head, conveying her lack of understanding, repeating Black Kettle's name, stressing her need to warn him. More Cheyenne gathered, women and children peering from teepee entrances, their eyes wide with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with palpable tension. Just as a sliver of despair began to penetrate her resolve, a figure emerged from the largest teepee. It was Black Kettle. His eyes, when they found her, registered surprise, but not immediate hostility. He raised a hand, silencing the warrior. Abigail stumbled forward, the words erupting from her in a torrent. "Mr. Higgins, from Redemption Gulch. He was lying. He claimed your people stole cattle. He was bringing a posse. They intended to attack." She recounted what she had witnessed, Higgins' men, the surreptitious movement of the cattle. Her voice was hoarse with urgency, her face etched with genuine alarm. The younger warriors exchanged uneasy glances, their distrust a visible current. Some tightened their grip on their weapons. But Black Kettle listened, his dark eyes fixed on Abigail, searching her face, her demeanor. He remembered her, the quiet woman from the trading post, the one whose eyes held no guile. He saw the authentic terror in her now, the desperate plea for him to believe. He also remembered his own profound loss, his wife, Singing Reed, taken by the white man's sickness the previous winter. He understood sorrow intimately, and he recognized the spirit of one fighting against a looming injustice, however outmatched they might seem. He asked slowly, his English careful, if she spoke the truth. As God was her witness, Abigail managed, tears finally escaping and tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. They would be there soon. He wanted this land. He wanted to drive them away. A profound silence enveloped the small assembly. Black Kettle looked from his warriors to Abigail, then back again. He had encountered this brand of treachery before, the insatiable hunger of the white man for land, their readiness to employ deceit and violence to achieve their ends. The white man's greed, he murmured, more to himself than to her, was a relentless fire. Then, his gaze met Abigail's directly, and a deep sadness softened his features. "My wife, Singing Reed," he said. "Her spirit left us when the snows lay deep. My heart has been an empty lodge since that day." His words, so unexpected, so deeply personal, resonated with Abigail to her very core. In that charged moment, surrounded by suspicion and the threat of imminent violence, an unspoken understanding formed. Two souls, each acquainted with loss and the sting of isolation, found a common ground. Black Kettle turned to his warriors, his voice firm. "This woman," he declared, "has risked greatly to bring this warning. We will heed her." Then, to Abigail's astonishment, the faintest hint of a smile touched his lips. "Higgins," he mused, "is a man of loud words, but perhaps his mind is not so sharp. You know this town, Redemption Gulch. You know this man. Tell me, Abigail Sawyer, what specific weakness does he possess that we might use, besides his aversion to truth?" And so, as the sun bled orange and crimson across the western sky, casting long, foreboding shadows, an improbable alliance was cemented. Black Kettle, the grieving Cheyenne elder, and Abigail Sawyer, the ostracized settler, began to weave a plan. It was not a plan for war, but for the unmasking of a liar, using Abigail's intimate knowledge of Higgins' character, his vanity, his overconfidence, and the two men he trusted with his dirty work. The true turning point was not merely his belief in her, but that in their shared vulnerability and combined insight, they found a strength and a strategy that neither could have conceived alone. The last vestiges of daylight clung to the prairie as the faint, rhythmic drumming of hooves announced the posse's approach. Black Kettle's warriors, armed but artfully concealed, blended into the deepening twilight that enveloped the clearing. Abigail stood near the central fire, beside Black Kettle. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat mirroring the approaching riders, yet a strange calm had settled over her. She had made her choice. The elder himself was a study in stoic composure, his weathered face unreadable, but his eyes, missing nothing, held a sharp, anticipatory light. Soon, Higgins and his riders, some 15 townsmen, a mix of eager aggressors and visibly reluctant participants, came into view. Higgins, puffed with self-importance, rode at the head, his rifle held ostentatiously. He reined in sharply, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of Abigail standing, not as a captive, but as an apparent equal beside the Cheyenne elder. A sneer twisted Higgins' lips as he recovered. "Well now," he drawled, "look what the wind blew in. Seems our little spinster has found herself some new companions. Or are they your keepers, Abigail?" Black Kettle's voice, firm and resonant, cut through the charged air. "She is no one's keeper but her own, white man. She stands here as an honest woman, a quality some in your party might not recognize." Higgins' face darkened. "Honest," he scoffed. "She's a turncoat, a disgrace to her own. We're here for stolen cattle, Cheyenne. Hand them over, and the woman, and perhaps we'll overlook this trespass on decent folks' land." "There are no stolen cattle here," Black Kettle stated, his tone unyielding. "Only the stench of lies carried on a deceitful wind." "Lies," Higgins blustered, gesturing dramatically towards Jedediah Finch, who shuffled his feet, looking increasingly wretched. "Tell him, Finch. Tell him about your missing herd." Finch stammered that they were indeed gone that morning. "Tracks," he added weakly, seemed to lead this way. At that precise moment, as if summoned by Black Kettle's subtle signal, two of his young scouts emerged from the shadows. They led two men, their hands bound, their faces a mixture of fear and resentment. They were, unmistakably, Higgins' own ranch hands, the very pair Abigail had described. A ripple of murmurs went through the posse. Their bravado began to visibly fray. "These men," Black Kettle announced, his voice carrying clearly in the stillness, "were found not far from here. Not with our herd, nor in our camp. They were found with Finch's cattle, hidden deep in the eastern coulee, a place much closer to the trail leading back to Bartholomew Higgins' own spread." Higgins' eyes seemed to bulge. That's preposterous, a damnable lie. They're all lying, every one of them." Abigail's voice, surprisingly steady and clear, joined the elders. "Is it a lie, Mr. Higgins? I saw these men myself. Only yesterday, driving those very cattle. I noted their furtive behavior then. Now their actions are perfectly clear." She then added detail only she could know from her observation of Higgins' habits. "And I recall you, Mr. Higgins, meeting with these two behind the livery stable just 2 nights past. Your voices low, your heads close together. Planning this, were you?" The specific detail about the livery meeting struck one of the bound men like a physical blow. His eyes darted to Higgins, then to the stern faces of the posse. Seeing his employer's growing panic, and perhaps fearing the quiet menace of the Cheyenne more than Higgins' bluster, he suddenly cried out that Higgins told them to do it. Higgins himself, he accused, said it would stir up the necessary trouble with the Cheyenne, get them run off, so he could claim the creek land. The confession hung in the twilight air, heavy and irrefutable. The expressions on the faces of the posse members morphed from aggression to confusion, then to a dawning, angry comprehension. Their gaze shifted from the sputtering, cornered Higgins to the dignified Cheyenne elder, and then to Abigail, whose quiet courage now shone undeniable. Higgins, his carefully constructed facade crumbling, began to shout incoherently that she had bewitched them all, that they were savages, that no one should listen. He raised his rifle, his eyes wild with desperation, perhaps intending to fire and ignite the chaos he so desperately needed to cover his exposure. But before he could act, a commanding voice from within the posse cut him short. "Put that rifle down, Bart." It was Marshal Thompson, the town's usually quiet lawman, who had been observing the proceedings with a grim, assessing gaze from the rear. "It seems to me," he continued, his voice like chipped flint, "the only real savage here tonight is wearing your boots." Other men in the posse slowly, deliberately, lowered their own weapons, their faces hard as they stared at the now isolated Higgins. The artificial support he had cultivated through fear and falsehood dissolved like smoke in the prairie wind. Bartholomew Higgins stood alone, his arrogance deflated, his treachery laid bare for all to witness. Justice, it seemed, even under the vast, indifferent sky, had a way of finding its moment. The tense confrontation at Willow Creek concluded not with the crack of rifles, but with the quiet, decisive ruin of one man's greed. Marshal Thompson, his duty clear, took a visibly shaken Bart Higgins into custody, along with his 2 now confessing ranch hands. The remaining members of the posse, their faces etched with shame and a newfound respect for the Cheyenne elder and the quiet woman at his side, offered mumbled apologies to Black Kettle before making their subdued retreat towards Redemption Gulch. Their thirst for vengeance had been entirely extinguished by the unpalatable truth. In the ensuing days, Redemption Gulch was a hive of shocked whispers and reevaluation. Higgins faced a swift trial before a council of town elders. Abigail's testimony, delivered with calm precision and unwavering honesty, was the final nail in his coffin. Stripped of his fraudulently acquired land and publicly branded a cheat and an instigator of conflict, Bartholomew Higgins was given a single day to vacate Redemption Gulch, his name to become a byword for deceit. He rode out under a heavy cloud of disgrace, his ambitions reduced to dust, his reputation irrevocably tarnished. The immediate danger to Black Kettle's people was lifted. They remained at Willow Creek for a while longer, a tentative, fragile peace settling between them and the chastened townsfolk, a peace built on the hard-won currency of mutual, if wary, respect. For Abigail, however, her place within Redemption Gulch had fundamentally shifted. Some, like Martha, continued to shun her, their whispers now tinged with unease, suggesting she was somehow changed, perhaps even gone native. Yet a smaller, more thoughtful contingent regarded her with a quiet admiration for her courage and integrity. But Abigail knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she no longer belonged in Redemption Gulch. The whispers held no more power over her. They were merely the inconsequential buzzing of insects. Her world, once so narrowly defined, had expanded to horizons she had never before dared to imagine. A few weeks later, as the Cheyenne readied themselves to follow the herds to their wintering grounds, Black Kettle sought Abigail. He found her by the creek, her gaze fixed on the flowing water, a profound serenity gracing her features, a serenity that had been absent for so long. "The town," he observed, his voice gentle, "it is no longer your home, is it? Walks with Courage?" This was the name he had bestowed upon her after the night of the confrontation. Abigail slowly shook her head, a faint smile touching her lips. "No," she affirmed, "it never truly was. My people," Black Kettle continued, his eyes holding hers with a steady, earnest gaze, "we journey soon. My lodge, it has stood empty for too long. My heart has walked a solitary path since Singing Reed departed. You are a woman of strong spirit, Abigail Sawyer. Your eyes see clearly, and your heart speaks truth. Our paths have been different, but a good trail is made better when shared by two." He was not offering her charity, nor a desperate alliance against a harsh world. He was offering companionship, profound respect, a life to be built together. Abigail looked at this elder, this man whose wisdom and sorrow had unexpectedly mirrored her own. In his gaze, she found no judgment of her age, no condemnation of her past solitude, only a deep, unwavering acceptance of the woman she was, the woman she had become. She reached out, her hand gently covering his weathered one. "I would be honored, Black Kettle," she said, her voice filled with a quiet joy, "to walk that path with you." And so, Abigail Sawyer, once the overlooked and scorned woman of Redemption Gulch, rode away from the town that had long since ceased to be her home. She rode not towards an uncertain future, but towards a new life, a new family, at the side of a Cheyenne elder who had seen her true worth when others were blind. Theirs was not the fleeting, fiery passion of youth, but the deep, enduring warmth of a hearth fire on a cold night, a steady comfort against the inevitable hardships of the frontier. It was a love story written in the dust and sunlight of the untamed West, a testament to shared loss, mutual respect, and the quiet, unyielding courage to defy a world that sought to keep them apart. The trail dust rose behind them, not as a symbol of an ending, but as the promise of a new beginning. For on the vast, sprawling canvas of the frontier, the most profound and lasting stories are often painted with the most unexpected of unions, and true belonging is discovered not in conforming to the world's harsh dictates, but in bravely, defiantly, carving out one's own sacred space, with a love as steadfast and enduring as the ancient, silent mountains that watched over them.